Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where every day I explore how technology is solving real-world problems in your life, in your business, or indeed in your industry. And today, I'm going to tackle a pretty big problem. And just to put that problem into perspective, despite the rapid digitalization of contracts in our largely subscription-based economy, did you know that only 15%, I'm going to say that again, 15% of Fortune 500 companies are tracking the performance of their contracts, which results in up to 15 to 20% of the contract value actually being lost as value leakage, which translates to, wait for it, $2.3 trillion in lost revenue annually. But today's guest also has a story that began with life as a Wall Street lawyer who went on to become a serial entrepreneur. And he spent years working with contracts within the private legal sector and built his first company, UnitedLex Corporation, to more than $300 million in revenue. But that's just only a small part of his story. And when I read that his latest venture, SirionLabs, went on to raise a further $44 million this year and is now valued at $250 million, after reading that on TechCrunch, I had to get him on the podcast today, especially because he's already trusted by 200 plus leading organisations, including heavyweights such as BP, Vodafone and Unilever, and they've actually saved their customers over $2.2 billion, which is, again, just phenomenal, isn't it? But enough from me. Buckle up and hold on tight so I can beam your ears all the way to India so we can speak with Ajay from SirionLabs right now. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Thank you for having me on your show, Neil. A real pleasure to be here. My name is Ajay Agrawal, and I'm the founder of SirionLabs. SirionLabs is a CLM company that uses artificial intelligence to extract the promises that are inside contracts and to breathe life into them.
I'm excited to get you on the podcast today for so many reasons, and we will learn more about your technology and your company in a few moments. But something I always try and do on this podcast is learn a little bit more about the human story behind a tech company too. And a little research on you, I discovered that you spent years working with contracts within the private legal sector and built your first company, UnitedLex Corporation, to more than $300 million in revenue. So I've got to ask, can you share that backstory with us today and how it led to your latest venture, SirionLabs?
Happy to do that, Neil. But even before UnitedLex started, I was a lawyer on Wall Street back in the 1990s, working on asset-backed securitization and other complex securities issuances. And the UnitedLex journey really was about taking low to medium complexity pieces of work outside the ambit of the law firm and seeing if we could either do it from a low-cost jurisdiction or we could automate it altogether. And both of those activities were critical in delivering value to our end clients, which tended to be Fortune 500 companies. It's the second bit that really, really caught my fancy towards the end of the last decade. And if you look at some of the journeys we were having at that time, already with large suppliers like HP, IBM, DXC, we were finding that whether it was large suppliers like them or their clients, they were all looking to go past just the storage of contracts in a repository and trying to figure out how to keep each other accountable to the promises that were sitting inside those contracts. That topic had already become a very live topic. And I think it's a very logical evolution of a journey that began in the late 1990s, right? Because in the late 1990s, all business documents tended to be in paper. They used to sit in closing boxes, and those boxes used to get shipped to warehouses. Motorcycle riders used to go out whenever you needed to get access to a previously executed set of deal documents. And what you ordered in the morning would either arrive at 3 or 4 in the afternoon or the following day. That's how you used to refer to the past. This is when I began my career in the late 1990s. And then by the time you digitized all of that content in the late 1990s using the new technologies of Adobe and Acrobat, and moved into this new modern world of electronic documents by the beginning of the last decade, you can imagine how the journey, the first 10 years of the journey, is really what it took for people to get their documents into the repository. And it was only by the end of the last decade, let's say 2008, 2009, that people started asking the question, now what can I do with all of these electronic documents that are sitting inside my repository? Can I go one level deeper and start extracting the promises inside there? Can I use those to really hold people accountable to those promises? And that's a fascinating conversation. That is sort of what started to happen in my previous company in that time frame, 2009 and 10. And really, after a short gap at Stanford, lies at the heart of my second company, Sirion. Because what we realized is that going from storing contracts to holding people accountable to the promises is not as simple as it sounds.
And something that really surprised me was when I recently read that only 15% of Fortune 50 companies are tracking the performance of their contracts, resulting in up to 15 to 20% of the contract value being lost as just value leakage, which actually translates to $2.3 trillion in lost revenue annually, and which it just blows my mind. And SirionLabs, your aim is to streamline contracts for the needs of modern businesses. But can I ask that you set the scene and tell me a little bit more about those kind of problems that you set out to solve for businesses? Because I suspect that a lot of people listening might be completely unfamiliar with just how much waste is going on there.
Absolutely, absolutely. If you look at global third-party spend, both private organizations and federal public sector buying, it's order of magnitude between 50 to 60 trillion annually. And very broadly speaking, you can divide that 50 to 60 trillion third-party spend into two broad categories: simple and complex. The simple spend tends to be goods, commodities, and the best way to understand that spend is we call it P times Q spend. The price is in the contract, the quantity is in the purchase order. When the goods arrive in your warehouse, you do a quality and a quantity inspection. And 9 times out of 10, Neil, that's a guarantee of value received. So you really don't need to do anything else with it. So that's, let's say, about 20 or 25 trillion out of that 50 trillion. What about the rest? The remaining 30 trillion is services. And what's fascinating is that if you go back 25 years, the ratio wasn't exactly the same. Today, 60% of global third-party spend is services. But if you go back 25 years, it was the other way around. It was 80% was commodity spend, P times Q spend, and only 20% used to be services. So services has really grown as a proportion of the overall third-party spend in the last 25 years. It is one of those macro trends that has really reshaped people's exchanges with each other. That's why very often you will hear words like service economy or subscription economy. That is the result of consuming as a service today what you used to buy as a commodity 15 or 20 years ago. And I'll give you a simple example. When most of us started our careers, people used to buy printers and copiers. No matter which company they worked in, they would buy their office printer or copier. Today, if you look across the landscape, it will be a very rare company that actually buys an office printer or a copier. 9 times out of 10, they will have a managed printing and a copying service with a company like Xerox, who will come in, bring the machine, will repair it, maintain it, replace the toner and the paper and the cartridges whenever they need to be replenished. So we've suddenly moved from buying capital equipment to consuming a managed printing service outcome. We've realized We are really interested in our people being able to access the printer and printer quality document. We don't really care about owning the underlying asset per se. This evolution to a service economy has meant that contracts have become more complex over time. Instead of just listing the goods and the prices associated with them, they have now moved to painting complex outcomes, business outcomes that the buying party wants. And this in turn has radically changed the expectations, both from procurement as well as contract management softwares. That's where the opportunity is today, is understanding how we can make sure that those complex business outcomes that were promised can be automatically extracted from a contract using artificial intelligence, how we can use elastic technology to monitor those outcomes and connect them to other business transaction systems, and ultimately how we can even audit the invoices that flow back and forth between buyers and suppliers and ensure that the financial value stays close to what was promised under the contract. That is where the leakage comes in. 30 trillion is being spent on services. And even if you take a modest number like 10% of leakage, that would take you to 3 trillion of leakage. That's where that number comes from. It's 10% of that annual $30 trillion services spend, Neil.
It's a phenomenal amount of money there. And of course, it's also a massive opportunity to take CLM to another level by allowing companies to go beyond signature and into that operation stage of a contract where they can easily manage things like risk, obligations, and entitlements. But is that something you can expand on?
Very much so, Neil. So if you look, one of the ironies of the modern contract is that 90% of the surface area, the verbiage in a contract, tends to be devoted to managing the risk of extremely unlikely events, swan events or tail risk events. You have your force majeure clauses and your insurance clauses and your limitations of liability and so on. And only 10%, and that too buried deep inside your annexures and your exhibits and your schedules, tends to be about the actual business value that is intended to be transferred through those contracts. So 10% of the verbiage is driving 90% of the value. That's a very bizarre situation. And what's even worse is that a lot of the AI and the technology that's available to parse these contracts to read them is focused exclusively on the metadata that covers the unlikely events. So therefore, Sirion's focus and my focus as an entrepreneur has always been to bring alive that 10% underdog that's buried inside the exhibits and the schedules, but who carries 90% of the value on his puny shoulders and bring them back center stage. That's what our technology is all about. Let's talk about what promises we make to each other, and let's help to bring them to life.
And I also recently read on TechCrunch that SirionLabs raised a further $44 million this year and is currently valued at over $250 million, I believe. And you've also you're already trusted by 200 plus leading organizations, including leading names such as BP, Vodafone, Unilever, and it's actually saved your customers over $2.2 billion. So just to bring to life everything that we're talking about today, do you have any successful use cases or real world examples of how you've helped these businesses achieve this operational excellence and why it can be why it can be so transformative in challenging economic times that we all live in now? Because I think everybody's trying to do more with less at the moment and look at how they can increase their revenue. And there is a lot of waste there that you guys are helping with, isn't there?
Very much so, Neil. Very much so, Neil. And I think a lot of that value comes from a very simple realization that the old-fashioned way of treating contracts as a technology island and storing them in some back-end repository is not the right way. The correct way to leverage your contracts and indeed the information and the promises inside those contracts is to link them with your front-end business transaction systems, your ERP, your CRM, your P2P, and your other ITSM tools. And the moment you do that, you amplify the likelihood that the promises and the commitments made inside those contracts have a higher likelihood of coming true. That's where the value starts to flow. That's where the leakage tends to get reduced. 3 small examples of that, right? Today, it takes so many people in these complex, large services transactions to decipher the commitments and the obligations and to manage the D&O registers to understand what's inside these contracts and keep that updated. That work can be totally automated if one applies the right kind of technology force to it. The second problem is performance tracking. So how do we know, whether the promises that were made inside a contract exactly correspond to what was delivered subsequently, either as a supplier to help us to deliver or even as a buyer to help us to monitor? And that work, again, can be automated. We are still talking about efficiency. So the first vector of value is doing with technology what used to be done with human beings, and that can generate a lot of savings and speed and efficiency. But the second and bigger, and I think this for me is a much deeper realization, contract management systems and even procurement systems of the past tended to be very back-end systems. So it's my system, it's my data, right? And whenever I talk to you, it's my data versus your data. We both have the same contract with each other, right? You are the buyer, I'm the supplier. We still have the same contract. But it's always your version of the contract versus mine. We never seem to be operating or singing off the same sheet of music. And that really is, I think, for me, a very profound thing. If we can get a single system of truth, a single source of truth between the buyer and the supplier, and now instead of looking at a contract, they say, oh, here are the 134 obligations that I'm supposed to do for you, and here are the 9 obligations that you are supposed to do as a buyer. And now we've baselined the outcomes, the promises we've made to each other. That's a fascinating use of technology. I don't want to use words like permission ledger or blockchain. For me, it's as simple as sharing expectations with each other, no matter what the technology medium that's used to do that. But once we do that, then a huge second vector of value opens up, and that is the reduction of friction in business relationships. What is friction? Credits, claims, disputes, litigation, service level penalties, lack of anticipated growth, delayed payments. All of these tend to go down by as much as 60 to 80% when you have a single source of truth between buyers and suppliers. So whether you call it permission ledger or blockchain, or you find some other way of sharing your expectations with each other, that's the direction you want to go. You don't want back-end systems. You want systems which allow both parties to share their expectations with each other. And the last and the biggest possible vector of value is invoice auditing. Today, the promises sitting inside contracts, the ensuing performance, and the ultimate invoice preparation tends to be extremely manual. And that creates the risk that the person either creating or auditing the invoice will unwittingly end up ignoring what was in the contract or the actual performance or the consumption that followed thereafter. And this creates invoice leakage. Invoice leakage can, create error, can ensue from errors like incorrect consumption, incorrect scope, rate cards, missed deliverables, missed penalties, and so on and so forth. And to put a figure on that, anywhere from 8 to 10% of the invoice value can be leaky or can be incorrect, can be captured as in the form of discrepancies. And Sirion's track record with its clients is that we have managed to claw back about 5.5 to 6% of invoice value whenever we've acted on behalf of a buyer. And whenever we've represented suppliers, we've been able to get them to increase the value of their invoice by anywhere from 2 to 5%, because they are not today claiming their entitlements or not invoicing for over delivery. So the leakage happens on both fronts, Neil. And I hope that gives you some sense of where that 2 to 3 trillion of value leakage comes from.
It really does. It's also opened up my curiosity on the kind of role that technology is going to play and continuously improving that as well. So, do you think that things like AI will play an important role in strengthening relationships between those buyers and suppliers? And also, additionally to that, what do you think is the key to building trust over the long term, and the kind of role that technology will play in that too?
Very much so, Neil, and a great question, because at the end of the day, if the information sitting inside a trusted common source, a trusted single source, is still being generated manually by human beings, it can create the risk that it's your interpretation versus mine, right? And that then goes back to the conflict zone or the zone of friction. But if it's if it's artificial intelligence, or if it's driven by an algorithm, and both of us accept the way that algorithm is set up and configured and extracts data, then the likelihood of acceptance of that goes up exponentially. And I think, so that's the first part, is the acceptance of what is inside either a performance artifact or the contract itself. The second, I think, implication is the manner in which that data is then communicated between the two parties, right? So if the invoice being prepared is accessible to the supplier and it allows them to validate different line items as it's being prepared, that drastically reduces the validation cycle on both sides, right? So that's another example of how value can be generated when parties are working together and using AI to do that. Both the content piece and the validation piece.
And as someone that's working right in the heart of this industry at the moment, and also passionate about technology too, are there any new and exciting technologies that modern enterprises you think need to bring in to improve visibility and collaboration? Is there anything that stands out to you?
I think there are several technologies, Neil, which will probably only get adopted progressively. I think for me, the four major clusters of innovation that are due for progressive innovation and adoption. The first is this notion of auto extraction. And I think today we still, particularly in the very large enterprises, tend to place too much emphasis on human judgment in extracting content from valuable business artifacts and always having an eyes-on review. I think we need to learn to trust the technology a lot more. We need to accept that the technology is doing a good job of, or a trustworthy job of extracting the information that we need for our business purposes. So that's the front end AI piece or the NLP piece. The second piece is when that content comes into contact with the other enterprise business transaction systems. And this is now about consumption, it's now about performance, it's about obligations and service levels and credits and earnbacks, and understanding that the act of human beings in validating each other's performance or consumption can very easily be driven by algorithms which are based on the values and the equations that are set out in contracts. So once you convert natural language data objects into algorithmic objects and you put them in touch with the main business feeds that contain the raw data, validation can happen in a continuous loop. This is a very major element. And I think what will happen is people in major corporations will start accepting the viability of this mode of validation in small, discrete areas to begin with. So somebody will start with service levels in IT, somebody may start with timeliness in logistics, others may focus on facilities management as their starting points. But either way, as these pockets of acceptability grow and ultimately coalesce with each other, we will see that what is today a very large zone of manual activity, which is validation, simply validating quantities and amounts, that will get replaced by algorithms and software over the next several years. The third big area, according to me, is this whole transition that we are seeing from SaaS to business networks. And I think that this notion of SaaS is very, very powerful. Certainly software in the cloud is a very modern and a contemporary phenomenon. But even that is now under pressure because there are a lot of companies that are emerging which are structured as business networks. And business networks like DocuSign, for example, like Demerara, CNFO, they have the big advantage of connecting parties with each other. So it's no longer about my system versus your system, my data versus your data. It's both parties working seamlessly and collaborating at the level of the transaction itself. So I think that is another major evolution. Companies accepting that having a system that is common to each other is actually better than having technology that does not connect to your counterparty. And ultimately, I think at the end, it's about predictive technology. How do we use the information in all of these three front-end technologies to analyze it, to understand our past in such a way that shapes our conduct for the future? How do we rewrite better contracts to avoid conflict, to reduce conflict? How do we shape our performance parameters to amplify the probability of those performance criteria being met, of service levels being green, and so on and so forth? So that's the predictive element.
Excellent. And of course, I think we've got to mention as well that it has been a year of incredible uncertainty, and businesses of all sizes have been nervously navigating through uncharted waters. And I've got to ask, what kind of challenges has your company had to overcome this year?
Yeah, great. Look, there are challenges that we've had to face as a mid-sized software provider with approximately 500 employees. I remember I had come to India on the 4th of March, and within 4 or 5 days of my arrival in India at our offshore development center, we took the decision to go 100% work from home. So 500 people in almost 16 global locations worldwide suddenly stopped working at the office, and within a span of 8 or 9 days, we had gone to 100% work from home situation. So that was a pretty big challenge, right? How do you work remotely from home? How do you monitor productivity? When people are working remotely, and how do you manage morale? And of course, security and encryption and all of these issues that come up when you suddenly make a switch from one mode of working to another. There are several other challenges as well. I think we are very fortunate, Neil, that as a company, we saw a flight to quality when it comes to capital. Yeah. And from a capital perspective, we certainly did not feel challenged. I know that many other companies were not so fortunate. If you look at the period between December 2019 and let's say March 2020, a lot of companies who did not understand the true magnitude, venture-backed SaaS and technology companies who did not understand the true magnitude of what was about to unfold in COVID, continued to manage their capital in a way that presumed that a capital top-up or additional rounds of financing would be just around the corner. And I think what they're finding to their dismay is that is no longer a valid assumption. And I think for those fortunate few who were not just COVID geared, but continue to thrive in this environment, they're finding quite the reverse, that instead of seeing 5 or 10 interested investors, that number's gone up 3x or 4x. And that's what I call, broadly speaking, a flight to quality, Neil.
And of course, many are saying that during any economic downturn, it's often a catalyst for innovation. Now, I know you guys have had a new tech center in Seattle, so I appreciate it's probably not too much that you can share, but what's next in terms of a new products that you're designing through that tech center, and what's new on the innovation front that will help you continue to fuel this growth for the company over the next decade and beyond? Well, the Seattle Center and what we are doing there is certainly very, very exciting stuff. There's a lot of patents and intellectual property in progress coming out of the Seattle Center. So what I can share and will share with you is at the highest level,
The problem with applying NLP, machine learning, and other forms of artificial intelligence to business artifacts and contracts in particular has been that the entire approach has been very enterprise-led for the last 15 years. So when you look at the existing players in this industry, their entire approach is geared towards creating a satisfying experience for an enterprise customer. Nobody thinks about this problem from the way, for example, that Google thought about this problem when it came to searching. Today, as somebody who wants to go to Wikipedia or to Google and to find out about something, you don't need to navigate your curiosity through your enterprise channel, right? You can go directly and you can type your query in a natural language and immediately receive an answer. It's instant gratification. Something of that kind needs to happen in the world of business information too. So Neil, what we need to do is be able to move away from a very structured application first way of uploading content and then being able to analyze the data inside or the information inside that content or artifact as the case might be, and be able to very rapidly ask questions of our enterprise content. It could be contracts, it could be invoices, it could be any other kind of business document, and say, tell me, how many of my suppliers have force majeure clauses? How many of those force majeure clauses have pandemic sub-clauses inside them? Literally, for you to be able to say that question aloud to a software, and the software then answers you in seconds. Now, isn't that something interesting, Neil?
It really is. And I'm sure you've opened the curiosity in a lot of people listening in the 165 countries where people listen to these podcasts. And for anyone there that would like to reach out to you, find out more information or follow your progress, what's the best way to find you online and contact your team if they've got any questions?
I think the best way to reach out is to the SirionLabs site, either on Twitter or on LinkedIn. And of course, I'm very, very accommodating on LinkedIn requests as well. Always keen to learn about the problems people are trying to solve. My motto in this is, we are not the people who create software or products. We are merely vessels for our clients and our partners to fulfill their problems, to solve their problems and their vision. So very happy to hear from your listeners and from other people who may have thoughts and ideas on this landscape.
Absolutely love your motto there. And I think it's incredibly easy to see how you guys are leading the contract lifecycle management space, and especially with that platform that uses artificial intelligence to bring businesses into the future. But if we take the tech away for a moment, I think what I love more than anything is your personal backstory there that took you from being a Wall Street lawyer to serial entrepreneur. So much inspiration for other startup founders listening too. So a big thank you for taking the time to share your story with me today.
A big thank you, Neil, for this very warm and engaging conversation, and a real pleasure chatting with you today.
The fact that only 15% of Fortune 500 companies are tracking the performance of their contracts, which results in 15 to 20% of their contract value being lost as just, value leakage, translating to $2.3 trillion lost annually, completely blows my mind, like I said at the very beginning of this podcast. But with a problem of that scale, it's also easy to see why SirionLabs is enjoying 4 times customer growth over the last 18 months alone. But as I said in my closure to Ajay a few moments ago, it's his personal story that brings it all to life as well. From Wall Street lawyer to serial entrepreneur, by solving real problems through technology. And as you all know by now, I love stories like that. So hopefully we'll get him back on in a few months. So hopefully we'll get him back on later in the year or next year and find out how that journey's going. But I'm afraid that's it for today's episode. So as always, if you've got any comments, questions, insights you'd like to share, email me techblogwriter@outlook.com. My website is techblogwriter.co.uk if you need me for anything, or you just want to browse through over 1,300 past interviews. Whatever it is, we've got you covered. So all that's left for me to say is thank you for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.